Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's ThinkIn. And we could have just sat and listened to that all night, couldn't we? Lanterns on the Lake, who happen to be not only a beautiful band, but also from Newcastle, setting the tone for tonight. So it's a bit of a different session tonight. It's still a ThinkIn. I hope you're still going to tell us what you think. But what we wanted to do really tonight with this is share some thoughts and an idea with you all about Tortoise Local, which is something we're hoping to launch later this year. And, in the spirit of, as I hope you recognize by now, our approach to doing journalism a little bit differently and opening our newsroom to everyone, we wanted to just sort of share our plans with you and see what you thought and see what, well, as ever, you can challenge how we think, and you'll probably make it a little bit better than it was to start with. So that's what we're about tonight. And the question is, how can Tortoise go local? And again, just a bit of our context is, we're in our third year now, and I think what we've realised as a members organisation as well as a newsroom is that our journalism always gets better when we hear like a range of opinions from people, and there's nothing quite like having voices from diverse backgrounds to make you study up and get more nuance into your work. So that's what we're about, and I think we'll get to why we think that model can work really well in a local setting, like a region or a city-based setting. But I wanted to introduce you with, let's do a drum roll, a little drum roll, to our man just outside of Durham, Duncan Maven, who's just joined us as an editor at Team Tortoise, and he is going to help us build a community of Tortoise members in the Northeast. And so, Duncan, I'm going to pass the mic, literally and figuratively, and it's all yours tonight to just tell us what you're thinking about how Tortoise Local sets up, and if you need a little bit of sort of Geordie chipping in, then that can happen too. But over to Duncan, and we'll just remind you, thinking wise, we've got Phoebe in the chat, and we still want to hear from you, even though we're going to do a little bit of show and tell of our own this evening. So there you go.
Thanks, Dave. You're not helping with the Ant and Deck stuff with the pass the mic. That's a terrible way for us to start. But so I will say this, please bear with me because I'm a newbie to this, and also because according to the front page of today's Financial Times, everybody in Newcastle is on edge right now over COVID. On edge was the quote they used, although I don't know if anybody else felt like we were more on edge here than anywhere else. I want to first of all just get a couple of cliches out of the way, because if anybody ever hears me use these at all, please call me out on it. So the first one is I want to make sure we never ever interview anyone outside of Greg's. It's just become such a terrible cliche, and I love Greg's sausage rolls, but there are other sausage rolls in the Northeast. And the other one is, and it's this one I really, really hate, is north of the wall. So you see it all the time in other people's stories, and they talk about north of the wall, and they mean Scotland. But as somebody who was born north of the wall but is English, I can, absolutely confirm there's a lot more north of the wall in England. So I was thinking about what we're trying to do, and one of the things for me, just sort of looking back at sort of a few decades really to when I was a student, and I did an MA in historical research, and part of it I looked at local news, and I looked at 18th century newspapers in Newcastle, and they were full of lots of really, really interesting stuff. But one of the things was that they had a lot of sports in them, which is sort of what you get a lot of in local news now, although the sports were very different. It was like rowing and horse racing. A lot of it was like, we're having a race on the Tyne today, bring yourself along and grab a boat. And then there was a lot of kind of scandal and crime and things like that. But a lot of it was about wars and taxes and geopolitics and, really, really big stories. And it felt like actually, that is sort of where we're coming from. We want to do something that's really meaningful at a local contextual level, but hit some of those really big stories. And a lot of it has been informed, as you'll hear, I think, that by what Tortoise has done over the last couple of years, and I'm fairly new, so I can't take any credit at all for what my new colleagues have been up to over the last couple of years. But we have done a lot of work trying to get out of London and trying to hear from different voices. And actually, I was going to turn to Phoebe in a minute, or very soon, just to hear a little bit more about what we've already seen and what we picked up about local news over the last little while. So Phoebe, I don't know if you're ready and you can maybe help out a little bit with that.
Yeah, no, of course. So a bit of context, if you missed it, in March, we did a ThinkIn as part of our Battle for Truth series on Is Local the Answer? I joined Tortoise about a year ago. I'm very interested in it. I trained and did NCTJ, which is, by the book, local journalism. And we had some really great people come and speak, like James Mitchinson from the Yorkshire Post, which is clearly a fantastic example of how to do local print journalism well. Megan Lucero, I think maybe in the audience today, and be keen to hear you in the chat, Megan, who's from Bureau Local, who was talking a lot about something that I was like really, really, really struck me, was this idea of the civic infrastructure that, I'm going to be cliched, COVID has kind of, made a big difference in how we view that local civic infrastructure. But she said some really good stuff on how, journalism is part of that, but now it's kind of expanded and we have all these other little pockets of community that we can really lean into as journalists, which is kind of what we've been trying to do at Open News for the last few weeks, which kind of Dave has been heading up with people like Sound Delivery. So it was really, really interesting to kind of move from that, and it's great to see that like the progression is going on. So I'm kind of excited to see what comes out of reporting in the Northeast as well.
Phoebe, the Battle for Truth thinking we did on local, that was one of the most popular we've done, right? Is that?
Yeah, no, it got loads of bookings, and there was a lot of interest from students and from our student ambassadors. There was a lot of journalists who were all kind of gabbing away in the chat, which was really, really good. And I think there's a bit of a fear at the moment when you lose that bit of an industry. So it's something that I worry about, and I was kind of, I was thinking, like the destruction of local news. And I think James Mitchinson kind of cracked into our question and was like, why are we being so pessimistic? It doesn't need to be like national and local. The question we asked was a little bit, negative in how we were viewing it. But he made some really good points on trust. And I think it's that's what it comes down to, and the quality of your journalism. And he quoted Friedman, actually, which I wrote down afterwards, and he said that the Yorkshire Post content model is kind of modeled after this idea of being connected, respected, and protected. And I think that's something you can take across the board in all your journalism as well. So but yeah, it was great to see like the engagement afterwards. So if anyone was also at ThinkIn and is here now, I'd like to think if you had any further views, like dwelling on it over the last few months, and see if you have any opinions on that in the chat, and then we can bring you in too.
Thanks, Phoebe. Yeah, I think it's really important that we sort of acknowledge right up front that actually it feels to me like we're moving into a sort of really rich local media environment, despite the challenges that actually all media face, whether over the model, the business model. It feels like we're in a really quite rich media environment, and I'm seeing some of the outlets mentioned in the chat already, but there's obviously a sort of heritage and a historic set of kind of publications, whether it's the Evening Chronicle or the Journal or the Northern Echo, the BBC Local Radio, somebody's mentioned, and William mentioned in the chat. I think there's also kind of a new scene that's developing. So Northeast Bylines I saw flashing by in the chat, and actually some of coverage out of Northeast Bylines has been really impressive, I think. And then there are a bunch of sort of specialist publications as well, right? Northeast Times, which is more focused on business, and Living North, which is kind of culture and lifestyle, and they're doing really interesting things. I think, you know, more broadly speaking, local news, it seems to be, whilst the model's under pressure, there's sort of a renaissance in terms of the quality in some places. So, you know, we've seen it with the places like the Yorkshire Post, the Manchester Evening News. The one that really jumps out in my mind is actually not here, but in the States, where, you know, the Miami Herald did all the coverage of Epstein, which is, you know, one of the most amazing stories, and kind of went missed by everybody else. And the Miami Herald picked it up and did really brave stuff. And thinking about that, actually, sort of one of the really important things, I think, for us is thinking about where we could collaborate. And so, you know, anybody who's in the chat and has an idea on where we might want to collaborate on stories, I think there's something really useful for us there. You sort of see it, I suppose, with some of the recent big stories at a national and international level, where you get the New York Times and Panorama and the Guardian and the Institute of Investigative Journalists all get together and they sort of amplify their work. And I think it means that they come up with different angles and they are better able to mine all of the information they've got, but it also just sort of amplifies it, and people take it a little bit more seriously than if it just came in one place. And you know, I'm hopeful that we might be able to do some of that. I think at the same time, it's also sort of, you know, we've been talking a bit about how much it's important to sort of think about Tortoise's kind of guiding principles when we do this. And so, you know, we are always looking, I suppose, and again, I'm new, so I can't take any credit, but looking to sort of shine a light in dark areas, ask the sort of difficult questions, also look for communities that are sort of underrepresented and try and give them a voice. And so that sort of leads us to sort of diverse voices in our network and so on. But, you know, that's sort of, those guiding principles, I think, have to be part of what we do in local. And then I think, you know, the other thing is the themes that come through that are sort of really important to Tortoise seem to match up a lot with what we're seeing in the Northeast. So whether that's kind of, you know, leveling up, the green economy, and that kind of thing, or, you know, disparities in education and healthcare. And so, you know, those are sort of big national, maybe even international stories that have a very much a Northeast context. But I think we're also looking for, you know, as always, this is a very open newsroom. We're always looking for ideas from our membership on what it is we should be covering, what are people really interested in. So, you know, that's another thing. I think Dave touched on it, but why the Northeast is partly because sort of, I guess we're thinking about where does Tortoise do best, and sort of looking at where are their stories, but also where are the communities that would work with us, where are there sort of existing networks of ours, and so on. I might come to Alison Stancliffe in a minute, because Alison, you're from Northeast Bylines. You mentioned collaboration and amplifying, and I just would be interested to hear your view on how we could maybe, you know, how have you found as a fairly new organization working in this region, and what has really taken hold. I don't know if we can get to Alison just to hear her view a bit.
Hi.
Hi, Alison.
Hi. Well, I'm sorry. I don't actually write for Northeast Bylines, so sorry about that. I read it with great interest. I never have time to actually write anything. But so Duncan, yeah. You've stabbed me there. But I know it's been going for. Let me see. I started reading it about a year ago, maybe, and that's what struck me, is that the quality of the journalism is often great. There's some good people writing here. I think some of them are actually on watching Tortoise just now. I recognize some names. And the model was the Yorkshire Bylines, I think, actually. So I like this idea that when it goes into Bylines, often I think, oh God, that's really important. But then where do you take it? You know, gets read actually by a very niche group of people, I think, Bylines still.
That's
where Tortoise could be helpful, I think. I think I've written in the chat about that someone like you can look at what's written with an eye, and if you did have some kind of collaboration with Northeast Bylines, there'd be a way of people moving their stories on, because everyone in Bylines, that's what they want to do. They want to move their stories on. So if Tortoise can use that as a motivation, really, I think they'd find an open door.
Alison, are there stories that you've read there that you think those were really good? I haven't seen it before. You know, things that are missed by other parts of the media.
Well, they're probably quite a lot, but at the moment I'm getting very, very exercised by what is happening in Northeast Durham, not too far from where you are, I guess, Northwest Durham rather. The asylum bill going through at the moment is proposing new detention centres, women's detention centres, and there's one that's already Mighty already commissioned to turn what was a horrific centre of abuse of boys in the 1980s into a women's detention centre, a place called Medhamsley, only it's now being christened Derwentside. They've changed its name, surprise, surprise. So anyway, that is very local. It's a local story with a national significance. And we're all scratching our heads about how to have bigger impact. And there've been several things tried. But there's an example of something that you probably don't know anything about. And yet, this detention centre just is so wrong in so many ways, and needs to be, the Home Secretary needs to be called out on it more. And so there's a local story that actually links to a national story.
I think you're exactly right. That's exactly the kind of thing that we're looking for, really. You know, can we do something that maybe others are not quite able to do? I saw in the chat, there was another comment from, and thanks, Alison. I saw from Jonathan, I think Haywood, and I'm just wondering, Jonathan made a point, you know, what can a London-based organization bring to the Northeast? I mean, that's a really good, relevant question. I mean, I'm not in London at the minute, but you know, I think that's a really good point. What, Jonathan, do you want to, if you're around, could you sort of elaborate on what your concern would be? Or
I mean, yeah, and I'm speaking as someone who also grew up in the Northeast and then lived in London for a long time. So I'm not necessarily just sort of trying to score a cheap point about the terrible metropolitan elites. A lot of the metropolitan elite come from Yorkshire and Tyneside and points north. But I think the challenge is, so at the Public Interest News Foundation, which I run, we've been doing lots of research into what I would broadly call the indie local media scene, which you and Phoebe were talking about a few minutes ago, this burgeoning scene of small publications that have sprung up mainly over the last 5 or 10 years. And it is a really exciting scene. And you know, we think there are 200 or 300. The Bylines network is part of that, but there are loads and loads of others, some of them serving particular identity groups, others very geographically focused, some doing very traditional kind of local newspaper type stuff, some in print, mostly online, others doing more innovative. So it's a complex, fascinating scene. I think the challenge is it's a scene that has sprung up to some extent in opposition to big London-based corporate newspaper companies, partly in reaction to the fact that those companies have withdrawn titles from parts of the country where they're not economic in their view, because they don't generate the margins that they once did. In many cases, those same places are the sort of left behind towns that we're now very concerned about politically what's happening in those communities. So I think my sort of theory of change, and many others, is that the best thing that could happen would be for those communities to find a way of having a voice of their own and a stake in the media economy of their own, whether that might be in some ways by facilitating local buyouts of old legacy titles and putting them onto a non-profit basis, or by stimulating those people that are already trying to set something up, many former journalists or young would-be journalists or community organisers that think having their own news publication would achieve a lot of democratic and economic value for their people. So I guess that's where I'm coming from. And then I'm thinking, okay, well, Tortoise, which I also love, but I think is a different part of the media ecosystem and the media economy. And I suppose my anxiety is this parachuting in? You know, is this helicopter sort of hyperlocal journalism that's descending from above? Is it meeting a real need that's coming up from below? And that's meant to be a constructive challenge. I'm sure there's something great to be done in the intersection, you know, where those different dynamics meet. But I'd love to throw that into the mix as a bit of a hope constructive challenge.
I think it's a really valid point, Jonathan. I mean, you know, you make a really good point. I'm going to throw it to one of my colleagues, Tessa, just to give her a chance to explain some of what our business plan is, and maybe that'll help explain it a little bit and sort of address, you know, some of your concerns. I'm sure we won't put them all to bed, but you know, maybe it'll help a little bit. Tessa, if you have time, if you're there.
Right. Actually, it's a really useful interjection. Thanks, Jonathan, because there are a couple of questions about the model, and Andrew Girdwood had a couple of questions about, you know, what sort of stretching of resources is required. So if we just take a step back, you know, we're all really conscious of not descending from London with our fancy media ideas. You know, it's never been who we've wanted to be at Tortoise, and I hope to God it's never what we've come across as. But, you know, right from the start, if you think about the sort of the ethos of Tortoise, it was how do you rebuild trust in media? How do you narrow the power gap? I.e., you know, how do you make sure that voices are being heard and that people's voices matter? And then practically, how do you reach those voices? Because that's what the team, a lot of people on this call who are here tonight, and Dave Taylor and Phoebe and Harika and whoever else on the call have been doing with the network, which is making sure that we don't sit in our bubble and we reinforce each other's opinions. We actively sort of suck other ideas into the newsroom as often as we can. And when we started, you know, we took the ThinkIn out on the road as much as we could, at least once or twice a week. We had incredible sort of coverage during election times. We went out on a roadshow about the rules. Oh, Polly's here. Welcome. Who's one of the original architects of the network. I've just seen her hand go up. Anyway, the point is, a lot of that got interrupted with the pandemic. You know, we couldn't be out where we wanted to be, and there were some real benefits about going digital with our ThinkIns, which meant that the barriers, the kind of geographic barriers to entry were lowered so people could come and be part of the conversation. But as we come out of the pandemic, and if we look at what Tortoise has, I think, proven in terms of revenue models for media organisations, we've never taken a penny through advertising. That's never been our model. So what is a sustainable model for media in the future? We think that we've found a model that works. What we want to do is lift and drop that into different regions to see if we can get a critical mass of members. And as Dave said, we picked the Northeast particularly because it's got a sort of triangulation of things that really matter. It's a hugely active and engaged sort of community. There are stories and things happening, and we want to talk about them. We've got a really good cohort of engaged existing members up there, and it's got a very active and big student population, which we know if we bring those things together, we're going to see if this model can be transported. And if we can make that grow out of the existing Tortoise model from a revenue and business perspective, we think it is scalable. We think you can replicate this model around the country, and we aren't going in to blot out other media in the region. We are properly collaborative and always will be, and we're there to enhance, not to replace. Polly, I don't know what you're doing, but you're wearing a bright yellow tabard. Are you on a anti-vax march, love?
No, I'm cycling home, but I had to get off my bike to join in the conversation at this point.
I introduce you?
Yes, please.
Okay, Polly Curtis is one of our original editors at Tortoise. And sort of, as I say, the real sort of architect of the network, which was our way of formally structuring bringing people into our world rather than just saying it would be a nice thing to do. She actually went and made it happen. And now currently Managing Director of PA News, but I don't think we have to curtsy, do we, Polly?
No, you don't, of course you don't. So I just wanted to pick up on Jonathan's point around the parachuting issue, because from the network, we started to experiment with Tortoise Local in the kind of spring last year, prior to lockdown. And what was really important when we started that was that we formed really great partnerships on the ground. And so, for example, we went to Grimsby, we had a partnership with the local paper, we partnered with the local library, and actually I can see some of the people that we met through those partnerships on the call here today. But what I thought was fascinating about partnering with local media was that it gave you a brilliant into the local community, but actually local newspapers were looking for someone to help them come along and re-engage their audiences. And I think local media has also got quite removed from communities. And what that partnership did between Tortoise coming in as kind of experts in listening, really, and the local news organisation, and then local community groups, those things all came together and did make it feel local. We were helping to facilitate, but we weren't being expert in any way. And I think if we just went in and did these events and reported, then it does feel flyby. So it all comes down to the quality of the relationships that you build in local areas. Yeah, that was the thing I wanted to say.
Thanks, Polly. That was great. I'll hand back to Duncan now. But I mean, if anybody has, you know, any concerns or thoughts, and Andrew, I take your point in the chat about partnerships and advertising there being a fine line. There really isn't from our perspective, because we are very careful about who we choose to partner with. We partner with people very deliberately. We do think it's really important to have people around the table who are able to affect change. And it's the people we're partnering with are the people who want to be having the same conversations in the world that we want to be. And we just think that's probably a more stable and sustainable footing for a revenue model for a media organisation that we can see at the moment.
Thanks, Tess. Actually, I was thinking about the network there, and obviously that is an important way for us to try and address some of, you know, Jonathan's concerns about kind of bottom up versus a top down. You know, I hope we're not top down, but I think the network helps us. And so I was thinking maybe this would be a good time to talk to Dave, or to have Dave just explain a bit about where the network is at the moment, because I think it's going to be a really important piece of local, maybe even more important than it is to Tortoise as a whole. So maybe if we can go to Dave, and you could just give us an update on where the network's at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Well, actually, next week we're going to publish an impact report on the Tortoise Community Network, which is essentially looking at years 1 and 2 and where we've got to with it. And again, I mean, we don't really talk about it enough, but you know, it really feels like it's the beating heart of what we're about, because I think, you know, an early voice from the sort of sidelines about Tortoise when we launched was, well, of course, you know, it's elitist because, you know, it's only, you know, people who can afford to pay for this journalism that are going to access it. And I think very early on we saw that was a valid thing to say, really. And so we set up the community network where, again, I mean, to think about the sort of impact of some of our business partners, it's actually been funded by our commercial partners. And the way it goes is, you know, there are some people on this call who happily pay their own membership to be part of Tortoise, and there are others on this call who are fully funded members, and they've been funded by either our business partners or, you know, philanthropically minded individuals who are part of Tortoise as well. And, you know, there's 11,000 members activated who haven't paid for their own memberships of Tortoise, who, you know, some of them are really familiar names who like join in virtually every session that we have, you know, and make their voices heard and challenge us, you know, just the same way Jonathan has already tonight. And I think that, to me, feels like something new under the sun. You know, I mean, that feels like we are properly doing journalism in a different way. It always makes our storytelling better and more thoughtful. And you know, if you look back at you know, 2 or 3 of the things that we're probably most proud of you know, doing journalism in this last turbulent period, they came from network collaborations. We did this thing called Unheard Voices really near the start of the pandemic, and it, you know, you heard from you know, people who were recovering from addiction or from who were dealing with mental health issues. It was like a really memorable strand of the story that was about Filipino domestic workers who'd basically been cast out by these wealthy employers, and it was, you know, you heard from them, you heard about their predicaments, and I think we were telling stories that that people don't often hear, you know, and that's the test that we that we want to live up to. We want to do justice to the members of our community network. And again, just a little bit about how we get to them, how we find them. Some people are you know, tenacious enough to kind of follow the thread which leads you to an obscure corner of our website and says, you know, we'd love to hear from you if you think you might be someone who would benefit from a free membership of Tortoise. You can actually do that. But actually, most pressingly, what we've done, we've gone out and we've created this really sort of wonderful ecosystem of like about I think at the last count, 75 charities and non-profits who all work at the front lines of change, you know, who are, you know, think of like the Social Mobility Foundation that's like pushing, you know, young people from, you know, from normal backgrounds towards, you know, the sort of bigger universities and making that their mission. We work with Multiverse that works with apprentices in really innovative ways, and several homelessness groups doing innovative things, and the point being that they introduce us to the people that they exist to support, and also some of their frontline volunteers who are really working in their communities. And I think what we're getting is you know, plurality in our newsroom. We're properly diverse and young in our membership, and you know, I've worked in newsrooms full of brilliant people where, you know, the model is this: every day about 4 people get together in the editor's office and say, what the hell are we going to do today? And they say, well, this seems interesting, who knows about that? And someone knows half a fact, and someone who's a quick study says, oh, I could probably knock something out on that by deadline, and that's how it goes. You know, that it's not you're not reaching out beyond your little rock pool at all. So so I think what we're trying to do, and you know, it's not easy. It's not easy to gather people into a membership organization and understand why they would want to be part of that, rather than just read it on, you know, stuff they can get for free. But I think what we've learned, if we've learned anything in the last 3 years, is that loads and loads of people seem to actually really want to be positively engaged in seeking change in the place they live, and it's actually quite interesting. It's better than shouting on Twitter. It's actually quite interesting to come and see if you can help shape with your experience and your knowledge. So in that spirit, I hope that we will. I'm not sure I understand. Siri is joining in. You'll be pleased to know. In that spirit, we sort of start with, you know, in Duncan's attic in County Durham, and hope to reach out to the entirety of the Northeast and try and build some collaborations, kind of try and be a force multiplier for brilliant newsrooms that are already there, and see if we can't you know, push towards like landing something for the Northeast in the spirit that, you know, the Guardian and the ICIJ and others have done globally, you know, with the projects that, you know, some of us have been involved in, like Paradise Papers and stuff like that. You know, it's amazing when 50 newsrooms suddenly all do the same story on the same morning, and they've all worked and done the shoe leather together. So it's a modest ambition to, you know, do good works and give people a voice. That's what it's for.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I mean, I think you know, yeah, it's a modest ambition. So actually, I was just reading through the comments there, and you know, there's a lively debate about whether we should be on the bus to collect our stories, because that seems like where most people are getting their news and their ideas. But I did see that there was somebody Sally, who was a contributor to Northeast Bylines, and pointed out, you know, an interesting thing there, which was a lot of those stories there are, I can't remember the phrase you used, Sally, but it was sort of about how they're a little bit out of step, I suppose, with much of the rest of the Northeast, and that they could be sort of construed as being, you know, kind of traditional and out of touch with kind of Brexit voters and that kind of thing. I wonder, Sally, if you're able to join us and just sort of talk us through a little bit, maybe how you've come up to stories and how you sort of, you know, how you might try and offset that.
Yeah, so I write for Bylines occasionally. I am not a professional writer. Most of my working life was spent in the NHS on the voluntary sector. But I've got to be honest. I mean, I am the epitome of middle classdom. You know, I read The Guardian every morning, or The Observer at the weekends. I'm living in Gosforth, which for those of you in the Northeast will get that. I suppose it's, I don't know, is it Hampstead or Islington? I'm not quite sure. And it is that liberal elite. And I'm an absolute Remainer. And I think when Bylines came around, a number of the people who were involved, who are brilliant, a lot of them were looking for a place and a voice because they felt that what was being said didn't reflect their perspective, which may or may not be true. But if I look and listen to others, I know that I have a perspective that isn't shared by others. I'm not even going to go at the levelling of the gender, but quite clearly the Northeast is changing. And Newcastle isn't the same as other places in the Northeast, and I've lived here all my life. So the difference in communities, the impact of migration, the impact of the universities, you can't compare somewhere like Newcastle and Hartlepool would be completely different places. But, you know, not saying one's right and one's wrong, but they're just different like any particular area. So there is a danger that what you're doing is replicating all those voices even more. So now I can talk to people who think like me, which is great. They happen to live in Bristol. So how do we get those different views to try and pull them in? Because there's still a lot of anger. But one of the things I wanted to pick up on was this about communities and networks, because I do think, you know, people always say, oh, it's friendly in the Northeast. I mean, we'll like to think that, whether it's true or not, I don't know. But there has been a huge amount in the last 18 months. But I think what is interesting, which may be different to other areas, is the state. We have a lot of public funded taxpayers institutions and about to get even more. So the role of the state is quite influential in the Northeast. I mean, the NHS is one of the biggest employers where I live. My rant's over. But how do you stop the dangers of, we're just going to talk to more and lovely people, but more like ourselves?
Well, maybe you could tell us, so you've contributed, I know you're not a professional writer, we're all, I mean, even professional writers, I think, are just basically amateurs at heart who decided to write. Do you get much response from those Northeast Byline stories, and does it tell you anything about the people who read them or the appetite?
Yeah, I'm not involved with the production, and you'd really need to speak, and they're a brilliant team, and I'm sure the people who are involved with Bylines, who live in Jesmond, will be very interested to engage with you, and they will know a lot more. But I just worry it's more of a different bubble. So I tend to write about inequalities, about food, and about women's issues and poverty, because that's what I've worked in for a very long time. So I tend to write about what I know, but it's just my opinion. And occasionally someone says to me, oh, I read your article in Bylines. But again, they are friends and they are people like me. So how do we get away from people like me?
I think it's a really good question. I think it's probably at the heart of, I don't want to sort of pretend that I can understand James or Katie's minds, but I think it's at the heart of Tortoise really, which was, in the aftermath of Brexit, I've heard them say this before, in the aftermath of Brexit and the aftermath of Trump, was how did the media not spot those things? And I think, you're making the point really, Sally, that part of the reason the media didn't spot it was because we were kind of talking to ourselves a little bit. This is, I think for us, local is in part about addressing that. And if we can do it with by geographically being in a different place, but I think also, you mentioned networks and communities, and obviously the network for us is a way to kind of try and address that. I do think, there is a really good point about sort of the London agenda, and, whether when we try and do local news, how do we balance something we don't want to do the cat up the tree kind of classic, very hyper local story, and we don't want to just follow the London agenda. I think Ian Campbell made a point about that so much of in the chat, there's so much of the news often is following the London agenda, and I don't know if Ian's around and maybe he wants to tell us what he thinks the other agenda is that we should be following, because I'm keen to hear as much as possible what else we should be doing. I don't know if we can get Ian. Is that possible? No. Okay. All right. Well, I think generally I would say please feed us story ideas. That's always sort of been a piece of the most successful piece, I think, of Tortoise. I think the other question that we've sort of been wrestling with internally, a big one for us, has been what we should actually produce, what we should sort of present to our members, and how it should sort of fit together with the broader Tortoise package. And so we're looking at newsletters, a sense maker newsletter. We're looking at audio and sort of whether we want to do a daily audio or whether we want to do something that's more of a deep dive and add something more in a weekly sense. We're also thinking about, how often should our ThinkIns be? Where should they be? I think there was a good comment in the chat earlier about doing them in, not just in the city library, but doing them in branch libraries. And so, all of that is sort of, we're in the middle of discussing it right now, and it would be really interesting to know what you think and what you want. I think we might even have a poll somewhere that we could possibly put up to see what everybody wants and whether there's a strong preference. There it is. If I'm going to claim sort of my newbie ignorance here, and I'm not quite sure how this is going to work, but I think if everybody submits their preferences, we'll get some sort of details. And I don't know, do we come back to that? Can anybody tell me? Dave, I don't know if you can tell me how this works.
I can tell you that you need to scroll down to question 3 to complete it. But other than that, I don't know, just have a go, see what happens.
Okay. Well, I've lost it, so I don't know if anybody else has got the results. They can tell me, but maybe we'll come back to that. So Henrietta is, oh, there we go. So what is that? A sort of preference for a weekly sense maker audio, and would listen to both. So that's good. Tess, I don't know, maybe it's worth just sort of going back a little bit to how the business will work. And, I know we're still sort of wrestling with it a little bit, and well, more than a little bit, we're wrestling with it a lot, but maybe you could sort of at least put some of the questions out there.
Well, we are planning to send a hat round at the end of this evening, right? That was the revenue model that we agreed, wasn't it, Duncan? I think
that's right.
I think that, I think the engagement, the methods we use, the sense makers, the ThinkIns, the good question about hybrid, sort of digital or in-person meetings. I think that's sort of definitely with you and Dave and the team to sort of figure out how we best serve the appetite, and we do that. I think in terms of keeping the lights on, which falls to sort of, well, you know, the team I work with, and actually to some extent you, Duncan, obviously, is how can we do what we've done with the existing Tortoise model, which is develop revenue lines, because we either provide we have partnerships with commercial partners. Now I'm quite excited about that aspect, because I think there's just an absolute ton of really interesting companies doing quite dynamic things in the region. And we know that one of the strengths, so if you think about for our members, our strength is bringing people together to have conversations that make people understand things better, and we hope, without being too pretentious, affect some sort of change. Sorry, it's just really started chucking it down here. I'm going to close my window, hang on. And I think we, you know, in the same way as we want to replicate the journalistic model, we want to replicate the sort of business coalition model, which is bringing organizations together with our members to help sort of drive the agenda in all respects, commercially and editorially, and with engagement with our members, and for the conversations we have. That's what we're going to try to do. So what we're really interested in is who's making stuff happen there. We need to find out, you know, we need to hear from people who are working with organizations that are doing stuff that hasn't come onto our radar yet. You know, which companies are really investing in the region, and which startups are really moving the needle that, again, we just haven't come across. That's the sort of thing we really want to hear about.
Thanks. While you were talking there was quite a good discussion of places where we could host ThinkIns, including pubs and libraries and lots of different places around the region. And obviously I know which ones I favour. Yeah, I think that has a real appeal. And Dave and I had talked quite a bit about actually the venues being part of the appeal of some of our ThinkIns. Obviously, we're talking about kind of moving on from, you know, it was Freedom Day today, so I guess we can go anywhere in theory. But yeah, once we're in person, it would be really great to be able to go to some of the more obscure parts of the Northeast and do ThinkIns in person in places that themselves are of interest. Yeah, I'm going to come to Andrew as well, because Andrew, yeah, you've raised this point about the word region, and we have sort of struggled a bit with what to call ourselves, frankly, and I wonder whether you had a better suggestion on what we could call ourselves.
And that's a really fair question. Well, from the Scottish perspective, country is quite popular. But I even doubt whether you want to do that, because I mean, Duncan, you've used the word hyperlocal a lot, and Scotland is not hyperlocal. For me, hyperlocal is a district within a city rather than just even. So I don't know. But the reason why I spoke up was probably the most cringe-worthy meeting I was at before the lockdown, so sort of early 2020, was a group coming out from London to say, look, we're going to represent you, we're not London centric. And you know, and it was the language of regions, and the regions, I felt a bit like, you know, the Roman emperor decided to visit, you know, they left the palace, and it was getting a bit cringe. So I don't know, sorry. I think you maybe have to work out just how local you want to go, and then find the word to describe that.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And as I say, we've been sort of wrestling with what the name is, and the name sort of drives so much. And, you know, it shouldn't really, it should just be a word, but it does feel like it kind of drives both our editorial ambition and, you know, the editorial reach, but it also, you know, it has the power to put people off, right, if you get it wrong. And so it's definitely something that's sort of on our list of things to really think about. And, you know, there was some good chat in the chat about what the Northeast even is, and I think that is a bit of a challenge. I mean, my own feeling is that it is sort of Northumberland down to Teesside, and you know, east of the Pennines, and that is it. But I'm sure there are lots of other definitions. I don't know, Dave, did you have a preference on what you think the Northeast is? Or not really. Same sort of thing.
Yeah, I saw that. I spotted someone saying, why are you talking about Grimsby in this context? And I think it's right to say that we see those two things as different projects, and we did a thing in Grimsby, and this is discrete from it. And I would never suggest that Grimsby was in the northeast. It might be in the northeast of somewhere, but I'm not sure where. So yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's the border down to Bonnyborough and Hartlepool and all of that, isn't it?
Yeah, and it certainly feels like in terms of the stories, right? At the moment, the stories are from that whole region, the northeast stories, the things that are important, whether it is levelling up or the Red Wall or the green economic revolution, for want of a better word. It definitely feels like those are in that. There's a sort of commonality between those parts of this part of the country. So, you know, I accept that that there is a challenge with, you know, Newcastle is a different culture to the rest of the region to some degree. You know, I certainly am aware of it. I grew up right on the coast. Dave grew up sort of nearer Newcastle, and I think even within a few miles there's a vast gap. You know, Gosforth and Jesmond have a different culture, even though they're pretty much next door. But it's the other question, I think, for me that I really wanted to sort of put to everybody here is, you know, how can we give a voice to the Northeast? What is it that we can do that can kind of bring people, you know, give people more say in the national agenda? Because I think that's kind of part of our mission, right? Is to help people speak up. And so, you know, if there are things that we're missing because, you know, we're coming from London into the Northeast or something like that, then please let us know. I think that's really, really important. And in terms of the places, I sort of love the ones that were in there. The Lytton Phil is an amazing place in Newcastle, but I think we've got to probably strike a balance between places that are actually accessible in the Northeast and places that are interesting. So there's a bit of a challenge there. Andy, I see in the chat, talks about an old reading list, so I would love to see that if you've got it. You know, we're open to all sorts of ideas on what it means culturally. And I think, you know, we'd just want to come back to that idea of where we should do ThinkIns. The branch libraries is really interesting, I think. Although I'm not sure how many of them are left. Actually, I think it was Ord who was in there talking about that, who I believe hosted us at one point before my time. And I don't know if Ord is still around and on there and would maybe be willing to tell us what it did for the library and whether there was any benefit to the library of us being there and what worked and what didn't work. That would be certainly helpful for me if you have a couple of minutes and you're still here to talk about it. Is that possible? No.
Possible. So we have a dozen libraries still open in Newcastle, and that's going to be the same for each local authority within the whatever you define as the Northeast, because there has been a bit of chat. But there was 2 ThinkIns. I think Dave was there for at least one of them. I can't remember. But from the library's point of view, what we're interested in is the kind of the information literacy side of what information can you trust and why, and where do the news come from, so all that kind of skills. But we also have a big area around community engagement, and so bringing different voices together was what I found fascinating in both of the, also because they are in person, and I think you get different interactions when it's in person rather than it's online. And you guys were absolutely great at making everybody speak. So maybe even the people who were a bit more shy, who would never have participated in the chat here or spoken because this is recorded. So actually in an in-person thinking, when you ask them a direct question and the rest of the room is quiet-ish, and you kind of manage to tease out things you would never have heard otherwise. And that's what I found really interesting. And then it's that I'm sure one of them, the first one I think was more general one about living in Newcastle, and where we had Chinese students there who spoke about their experience of, and we had people who'd grown up or moved to the Northeast. So it's hearing all those different experiences, and so that community engagement for us was hearing diverse voices and experiences that we wouldn't normally hear if we stayed within our little echo chamber, and therefore promoting that like better community understanding through hearing those diverse voices at the type of events you do. I hope that makes sense.
It does, actually. That's brilliant. Actually, it's really helpful to think about that, because I think, you know, in some ways we were thinking about different sort of locations would be cool and interesting, but actually you're making a really good point, which is that they also lead to a different group of people attending. And that is probably, I mean, obviously that's way more important, especially given what we're trying to achieve. So I think that's a really, really valuable point, that the venue itself, and, you know, I suppose we benefit in many ways, as you probably heard over and over at Tortoise, by, you know, digital events have been really, really helpful and have allowed different people to attend and so on. But I think once we get back to being able to do in-person events, that idea that you just expressed, that having events in different places means access, in and of itself, the location gives voice to different people, I think is a really, really interesting thing for us to think about. I'm going to wrap up. It's been really helpful for me to hear everything, and I think for all of us who are involved in this next stage of what I think people are calling the baby tortoises, and I think that's probably going to stick. You know, in wrapping up, I think it's been some really interesting views, Alison. You know, just thinking about some of those stories, that asylum bill story you mentioned, you know, that's exactly the kind of thing I think we want to hear. You know, I think Jonathan made a really good point about how we make sure that we don't appear to be sort of imposing something, but we're actually helping the sort of ground up approach to news, which is really important to us. And I think, you know, Dave talked a lot about the network for that. And, you know, Sally as well was really helpful. You know, how do we make sure that we're not just speaking to the same people? Because that is part of the reason for doing this. So again, I'm going to tell you again, I'm a newbie. I'm not quite sure how to wrap this up exactly, but I want to say thanks to everybody for all your comments, and you know, for helping out, because it's led to a lot of great information and feedback. Thanks.